Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Welcome to Hong Kong Confidential. I'm Jules Hannaford and I'm your host. I'm an Australian woman and I've been living in Hong Kong for many years. I'm a mother, a teacher, an author, and I want to share my wisdom and the wisdom of others with you. Thanks for joining me and I hope you enjoy the show.
You meet someone online and there's this instant connection. It's amazing how much the two of you just seem to click. They live somewhere far away and there's some plausible reason they can't travel to meet you. They tell you they're in love with you and you feel optimistic for the first time in a long time. They have a successful career, yet somehow they need money from you to solve a short-term problem, always with the promise of paying you back. Time goes on and they need more money more urgently. You've started to see the cracks and begin to wonder whether they've been lying this whole time. All of a sudden it hits you. You've been scammed. Fool Me Twice is the story of my mother, Jules Hannaford, a woman who was drawn into the dangerous world of sweetheart scams. After a trip overseas to meet a stranger, a dangerous altercation in a Manchester hotel room, and thousands of pounds lost for good, she's here to tell her story. Fool Me Twice, a true crime podcast, is available on Apple Podcasts, Ozcast Network, and anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
Today I'm here with Sarah Garner. Hi Sarah, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
Hi Jules, thanks for having me. I'm great, thanks.
Here we are again recording online. Normally I interview in person, but because of the COVID-19, I'm having to move to an online platform. So it's all quite new to me and feels a bit weird. I like sitting right next to my guests normally. Tell me a bit about your start in the fashion industry and what kind of roles have you had in the past?
I started very early on. It's actually the only industry I've ever worked in. I started in high school at Club Monaco as a sales associate. And I got hooked on the industry from there. And first role was in New York City, working for Bloomingdale's as a junior buyer. And then moved back to Canada, where I'm from, and worked for the luxury department store there as a women's wear buyer. And got the itch to move to Hong Kong. Well, I just wanted to be closer to where the epicenter of the industry was at that time, which was China. And came over to Hong Kong in 2007. I worked as a fashion buyer for Lane Crawford for a number of years. And then I moved on to DFS, which is a luxury duty-free shopping, and did all of their global inventory planning. And then moved on to a more creative role at Shanghai Tang and did more design, product development, merchandising, visual merchandising. And that was my whole corporate experience in the industry. Yeah.
Working as a buyer, you'd obviously have to be ahead of fashion trends and have a bit of an eye for what looks good and also what's coming up. How do you do that? Is it an instinct or do you have to research and prepare?
Yeah, I think there's some that's instinctive and somewhat innate in terms of your taste level matching the masses or being more directive in terms of taste level. But then, like every industry, you have to become an expert based on education. And so I used to have to be at the pulse in terms of reading magazines, reading industry reports, trend reports, and just always being on top of what was next and what was hot.
What was the feeling when you nailed it and you got something in that just took off compared to the feeling if you got something in that bombed? Did you ever have that experience?
Yeah, I think back then, a lot of what we did was instinctive. We weren't able to rely on data as much as there are the tools that exist today. So a lot of what we did when we went into showrooms and made the decisions of what would be purchased for these stores was happening sort of 12 months, 18 months before it would actually land in the stores. And so, yeah, you had to make a lot of guesses and bets on what people would desire at that time. And of course, yeah, we watched our sales very closely and it was always exciting if you made the right picks, but there were always failures in every batch. Yeah.
Did you just have to brush it off and keep moving on and not get too caught up in the failures and the things that didn't go well?
Yeah, you learn from them. I think it's like everything. Yeah, you eventually do have the data to inform future decisions. And the better, actually, what's great now is that there are so many more tools. And ideally, if you're very good at this role, you would make much less mistakes now than you would have in the past because you have so much data to inform those decisions.
What are some of the personal skills and qualities that you needed to be able to work in the fashion world? Because it seems to me from the outside to be a very competitive, cutthroat industry where I think you'd have to have a level of self-confidence and self-assuredness to be able to cope.
Yeah, I would say the devil wears Prada is not inaccurate in terms of the industry.
I love that film.
But in terms of what you need to succeed, and I think what a lot of people don't realize is that, of course, there's sort of the superficial nature of the industry, but ultimately, when you're in a role like a buying role, you're dealing with very large budgets and you have to deal with inventory planning. And so you actually do need right and left brain working together. And for me, when I applied to go into the junior buying program, the requisite was actually commerce and economics. So you actually have to have the marriage of both sides in order to take on a role in inventory planning or merchandising and buying. Yeah.
As you need the business acumen and the creativity. You've got to have both. Oh, that's really cool. What were some of the things that you love most about working in this industry when you were younger?
I think the attraction when I was younger was I really did love fashion and product. And then I was also drawn to the industry because of the travel opportunities. I loved to travel all my life and really wanted to marry career aspirations with a role that would allow for travel.
Was it as glamorous as it seems to us on the outside, or is it not quite as glamorous as it appears?
Yes and no. I mean, there were definitely times when I would pinch myself and wonder how I was getting paid to sit at runway shows. There were many weeks where I would be on the road in Milan, Paris, London, and New York. And you did ultimately just go to fashion shows day in, day out. And there were lots of fashion parties. And yes, those things did exist. But also at the end of those days, I'd be in my hotel room until 1, 2 in the morning writing orders. So it wasn't all glam.
It wasn't an easy life necessarily. Were there any issues that concerned you in this industry when you were working in it when you were younger?
No, in perfect honesty, in the beginning, I wasn't aware, along with the consumers and the industry at large. I just don't think the warning signs and the red flags were apparent, and they certainly weren't in the media. And so I trudged along, as many did, sort of just on this treadmill of consumption and fashion. And it wasn't really until the later stages of my career that some of those red flags started to emerge. And I was getting older and wiser and started to question some of the practices in the industry. At some point in the later stages, one thing that came to be was I was in charge of collecting and contributing destruction reports. So the luxury brands, it's become quite known that the luxury industry and the industry at large, but particularly the luxury industry, was guilty of destroying product at the end of its life cycle. So after it's gone through the stores, after it's gone through the markdown period, it often got destroyed, cut up, sometimes burned, in order for that product not to go onto the black market, not to go into the off-price channels, to basically cut off supply so that it didn't reach further channels. I was providing these destruction reports back to some of the biggest luxury brands in the industry. And that, of course, felt very wrong for many, many reasons, but just the waste that ensued from that. So that was one. And then again, later stages, I went to quite a few factories and was also quite horrified to see the conditions that people were working in and the production methods that were being used for a luxury brand as well. So I think a lot of things, just as my story went on in the industry, the experiences sort of add up. And another thing was I was in charge of these product life cycles whereby we were buying and getting the product through to the end of life, essentially. And there's always residual inventory. The product life cycle, the amount of product that's being put in front of consumers over the last 10, 20 years just keeps increasing. You're constantly getting more drops, as they say, in terms of what newness is hitting the floor and what frequency. And it's just unsustainable. It was unsustainable from the inside of the industry. You're ending up with more and more markdowns, and that pile up of inventory is something that's just crippling the industry and obviously contributing a lot of waste.
When you talk about the destruction of products, Is that because the designers don't want their products going out cheaply or being available on the black market because it then devalues the cost of their actual products because people can get them more easily? So they want to get rid of them so that people will still pay the high price point. Is that why?
Yeah, so the whole luxury industry relies upon this scarcity value, whereby if there's not a lot of it, if you think about the sort of pinnacle of luxury being Hermes, you can't just walk into a store and ask for a Birkin bag. There's a scarcity associated with the product, which creates the desire. And it's all very carefully architected brand desirability. And it ultimately comes down to the fact that there isn't a lot available and it's not available below a certain threshold of pricing. And without that, they can't uphold both their desirability and their pricing.
Right, that makes perfect sense. Thank you for clearing that up. That's really good because as a non-consumer of any luxury brands ever, it's very interesting for me to hear that because I don't move in that world at all. So I didn't really understand that. But I do know from watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians a little bit about it. Then when you were talking about the concerns in the factories, can you tell me a little bit about what the key issues were there that make you worried and make generally people who are in the sustainability world concerned?
Yeah, at the time, I didn't know too much other than approaching it from just a layman, to be honest, of walking into a factory. And I wasn't in charge of production at the time. I was just going there to have meetings. And these were luxury products whereby, let's say, leather handbags were being painted with no protective gear of the person that was doing it. And there were obviously fumes being emitted throughout the process. A huge amount of wastage from cut fabrics that weren't being used in the production cycle. Just the general conditions, I would say it was more of a human concern than anything else, but that was at the high end. It only takes a couple of Googles to see what factories look at, like in Bangladesh and the conditions in other places in the world.
Yeah. When you were talking about the glut of products in the industry, is that linked with fast fashion and this new wave of making it cheaply, making it not particularly good quality, getting it out there? People then wear it, it falls apart, and then they've got to buy again. That's my understanding of fast fashion. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fast fashion emerged in the 90s. And because consumers gravitated to it so quickly, they felt essentially that they could buy something for Friday night, wear it once, and then move on to the next thing because it was so cheap. So it ultimately became disposable fashion. But it put a lot of pressure on the whole industry because if you were at the higher end and you were, let's say, when I started the industry, there were two seasons. There was spring, summer, fall, winter. There were two seasons. That's all designers designed for. Fast fashion at that time would have been doing weekly or bi-monthly deliveries. That has since sped up to sometimes having deliveries every 2 hours on the shelves of a store like H&M or Zara. And so the amount of product flooding the market and also fast fashion bringing to market runway trends next week onto the sales floor, as opposed to the product life cycle that was typically in the industry where you would see it on the runway and then it wouldn't be on shelves for 6 to 9 months later. It just put tremendous pressure on everyone in the industry. And ultimately, what's ended up happening is that those luxury brands or higher end brands are now doing faster and faster deliveries. They're themselves trying to catch up with fast fashion. So it's just ended up this house of cards where nobody can keep up, and we're ending up with fashion just becoming an enormous, enormous problem and environmental problems.
It is becoming a huge environmental problem. And that, I guess, brings us to where you are now. And you have a company called Recycle. Correct me if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. Is that right?
No, that's right. Yeah.
And it's recycled high-end fashion clothes for children. Is
Yes,
that, oh, and
right.
also
Yeah.
maternity wear, isn't it, as well?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Was it all of this knowledge that you gained and this experience and this awareness of what was going on in the fashion industry and how it was impacting our planet that inspired you to start this company? And tell me a bit about how it began and what it does.
Yeah, I became a mom after my last corporate job. I was taking a little break to become a mom. And a few weeks in, I would say, not even a month, just felt that if I was going to go back to my industry or go back to work, it needed to be something purposeful and that I had to turn my experience into something that could provide a better future for him. I think that came from going back to what we were talking about earlier, is that the industry is quite superficial. And you come to a point in your life, and maybe that's why the industry is ultimately usually full of young people, is that as you grow older and wiser, you start to think about the purpose of what you want to contribute to the world. That was more of where it started, was just wanting to do something better and contribute to a better world for him. And then the company idea started from facing the problem myself. So a few months into his life, he had already outgrown, let's say, 100 items of clothes and was basically staring at a closet full of items that I could no longer use, but were in perfectly good condition. So the idea and the genesis really came from facing the problem myself of wanting to recirculate these items into the hands of others that would need and want them as well.
How does your company work? Do people send their clothes to you, and do they send them on consignment, or do they donate, or how does it work?
Yeah, so we're an online consignment platform. What that means is that parents give us their outgrown clothes and we list them on their behalf. So we basically do all the work for them. Normally, when parents send us items, it's not one or two items. It tends to be dozens, if not hundreds of items. So we take that hassle out of the equation. So we photograph, list, price. And then when the item sells, the parent gets paid automatically for those items. So they get a commission.
Is this an online platform and then you have a store? And do they work differently, or is it the same?
We are primarily online, and we have had pop-up stores, and then we opened a permanent shop location in October. And that's really meant to provide that offline experience. It builds a relationship with customers, but also for first-time secondhand customers, it's often important to really demonstrate and show them that secondhand can be just as good as new. That's the ultimate goal, is to establish trust that secondhand can be as good as shopping new. And we sometimes need that offline experience to win people over.
That sounds like a great setup, but how easy is it to convince parents to buy secondhand, particularly in Hong Kong, where people often have a lot of money and are really looking for high-end products? Is it easy to change people's perceptions and ways of thinking and things like that, particularly if they don't need to save money on their children's clothes?
Yeah, I think it has been. I mean, it's been a process. I don't think we've switched them overnight. And in large part, what has created adoption is other parents recommending Recycle to their friends. So we're trying to express the benefits to those in our community and really give them a wonderful experience so that they then go on to recommend us to their friends. I would say there's not a parent in the world who hasn't received a hand-me-down from someone, whether it's a family member or a friend. And so it's not a huge leap to have someone go from hand-me-down from friends to purchasing secondhand themselves. So as soon as they can make that connection between receiving something that they really wanted from a best friend, or a huge bag of clothes from a best friend, to, oh, that could be done through a platform. And also at that point, I can choose my hand-me-downs. So I think it's just getting people to try the first time. But normally once people try with us, they keep going and it actually becomes very habitual for them. So I think it's just that it's quite new. Lots of people, well, we're the only one of our kind here. And so it's just a new concept for a lot of people. So it's just getting them on board. Yeah.
It is a very new concept because, like in Australia, where I come from, there are op shops, we call them, everywhere. So there's secondhand clothing stores everywhere. And it really is an option for people to shop and find things. I think it's not so common here in Hong Kong. And it's interesting that you deal with mostly luxury brands. Is that right?
We do sort of premium through high end. So we basically just don't trade in fast fashion.
Right. Okay, great. Would you say that your customers are more aware about sustainability issues surrounding fashion, or do you think people don't realise the glut of clothes that are being disposed every year and the impact that it has on the environment?
I think consumers are becoming far more aware, and it just keeps building year after year. I would say it was about 2 to 3 years ago that it started to become mainstream. The headlines were really hitting. Fashion was the second largest polluting industry next to oil. And headlines like that really stand out to people, and they start to question how that could be. And of course, the Rana disaster in Bangladesh was another issue that put the industry on people's radars in terms of the destruction, both environmental, but also the human toll. So I think it's becoming more and more known and continues to be. So the consumer pressure is really what's driving change now.
So it's actually a little bit more about sustainability and saving the planet than saving a few dollars for a lot of your customers.
Yeah, it's the number one motivation for both customers and sellers is the environmental impact, the benefits of sharing essentially and making sure that the lifespan is extended through recycled. That's the number one motivation. And then, of course, it's nice to have accessibility to great brands at great prices as well.
Yeah, that's just an added bonus, isn't it? I was reading an article in Green Queen Media where you were featured, and it was saying that the fashion industry throws away 92 million tonnes of textile offcuts and unwanted garments into landfill every single year, according to figures presented at the Copenhagen Fashion Summit. Hong Kong alone sends 253 tonnes of textiles to waste landfills every single day. How does this impact the environment and Asia in particular, do you think?
It's shocking, isn't it? And
It's shocking. I couldn't believe it when I read that. I knew it was bad, but I didn't realize it was that bad. And Hong Kong is such a throwaway culture, isn't it? There's so, like, I know people that have furnished their whole house from just picking up, what's it called? The large rubbish waste throw out.
I mean, ultimately, it comes down to consumer culture and how much we're buying. So it just comes down to simply how much are we consuming, and we're consuming a lot more than we did even 10 years ago in terms of fashion. It's also the quality of the products that we're buying. So the more we buy, you were mentioning this earlier, the more we buy fast fashion and sort of with this disposable mindset, then clothes are getting worn far fewer times, and we're rotating through the clothes that we do have much sooner. And of course, if they're low quality, they're not suitable for donation and they're not suitable for resale. So in many cases, if you have bought something for the lowest possible price and you've put it through the wash a few times, it may not stand up to any further wear. Even when it comes to donations, there are lots of charities that are just being infiltrated with waste clothing. And so we're just shifting the problem essentially, and it ends up ultimately in landfill. So the problem is huge. And of course, as these clothes sit rotting in landfill, they're emitting greenhouse gases. And the more we use man-made fibers, the more those are causing even greater problems. So it's a massive issue here, but everywhere. And in Hong Kong, we're running out of landfill space.
It's taking up space in the environment. It must take a long time for some of these fibres and clothes to actually break down, if they even do break down. They're emitting the greenhouse gases, which are affecting the ozone layer and the UV rays and all of that. And then on top of that, there are some countries that don't even have the ability to dispose of all of this properly. So it just ends up in rivers and on mountains and flying around, and, it's not even properly deposited in landfill. So it really is becoming a massive problem, isn't it?
Yes.
How can recycling garments then help the planet? Does that mean that the demand for new products will go down and then the producers will produce less? Is that the idea?
There's so many things that need to be tackled in the industry.
Yes, because is it the production problem or the consumer problem? Where does the issue lie? Everywhere, I guess.
I do think it ultimately starts with the consumer. The industry will continue producing to meet the demand of the consumer. And so if the consumer is still demanding cheaply made products landing on the shelves every 2 hours, then the industry will meet that demand. So change is really only going to occur when there's a consumer shift and they put pressure on the industry to change, and they change their consumption patterns. So the resounding advice basically is, if you want to do better by the planet, buy less, buy better quality, and keep it in your wardrobe for as long as possible. So that's kind of the philosophy that everyone should be following if they want to do better by the planet. And then that will have a cascading effect throughout the industry. So what that does to fast fashion, hopefully they'll change their supply chain so that it's more friendly to the environment. And hopefully consumers will just choose better quality products to begin with, and there'll be less pressure on the industry as a whole to keep this cycle going at a rate that can't be sustained. So It is a massive industry with many, many problems. So I don't think there's sort of a way to simplify it, but we do need a solution, and recycling and reuse is definitely one of them.
So interesting when I was researching for this interview and looking at the industry, and I was just thinking I should go for a whole year without buying any new clothes. Like I could. I don't need any more new clothes. But there's something about that. We joke about it and call it retail therapy. But you go out, you buy something and you feel happier. What is it, do you think, about the human condition that makes us want to consume and that makes us need to buy more and more things to feel better about ourselves? It's a question for a psychologist, but you have a crack at it.
But it's a really interesting question. And probably the reason that I was interested in the industry to begin with is that clothing plays a very important role in our lives. It's the way that we cloak ourselves to present a first impression to the world. So by whatever we wear, we're presenting an image to the outside world. Whatever it is we want to say, we're saying it with our clothing before we're able to open our mouths. And so it does play a critical role in how we're consumed by the external world. So I don't think we can ever separate from them unless we go to global uniforms. But for the time being, yeah, it plays a role in messaging. I think it's in terms of desire and our propensity to consume, that is a machine. And I think a lot of people don't realize, and you do know this as an industry insider, is that there are trend forecasting agencies out there that their whole purpose is to create obsolescence in your wardrobe so that you need to consume something new. So, of course, as consumers, you're going, how is it that my bell bottoms were in and now they're out, and now tight pants and high-waisted pants are in, but my low-waisted pants are out? This is a machine that's created so that things in your wardrobe are constantly being made redundant and out of style, so that you have to keep consuming to stay relevant and stay on trend. And so
that begs the question, why do people need to stay on trend? What is it about a personality that needs to stay with the trends and be hip and fashionable compared to somebody like me does not? Do you know what I mean? I have no interest in it at all. So is it something that's learned because your mother was very fashionable and put a lot of emphasis on it? Is it to do with self-esteem? What is it? I guess it could be anything.
I think it's everything and anything. Yeah, I think it's all those cues that you've taken throughout your life. I do think how you're raised probably does play quite a big role. If you have a mom that doesn't care about fashion and didn't go to the shops, then chances are you might not have that same desire to consume, as opposed to the other extreme of a mom who takes her daughter or son shopping all the time. They'll probably see value in consuming. And so I think that's probably, it's always the parents' fault. So probably.
As parents, we can attest to that. My daughter has very little interest in fashion as well, so I think I can take a bow for that.
Oh, yeah, but I think it's just what we consume and what values we're taught throughout life.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it really comes down to the individual, and it's a very sort of deep psychological question that can't really just be answered off the top of our heads in a way. It depends on the individual. What role do you think advertising and social media play in creating this consumer desire?
Massive. I can't really think of anything that plays a larger role in the propensity to consume. Advertising from the beginning has been the number one. And I think it's all this created desire of you. And I think that's what you're talking to before in terms of what creates it. It's aspiration. Advertising and social media is creating aspiration that if you do this, you'll get this or you'll feel this. And so those images and messages are giving us the feeling that if we do what they do, we'll have an outcome similar to what's in the magazine pages or in a social media post. So I think that's what links the consumption with those messages.
So it's almost this way of making us happy.
Yeah.
Helping us find our dreams, when in actual fact, it doesn't necessarily have to be anything to do with consumerism. It could be connections with people or nature, or there's many, many other things, helping others, giving back to the community, stuff like that. All of that can make you feel happy. It would be interesting to see from your point of view, because I guess in the industry pre-social media, so social media has been around for maybe 13 years. I'm not sure how old you are. Were you in the fashion industry before that?
I was. Yeah, I'm sure I was. Yes.
Yeah. Have you noticed a difference with social media? And do you think that that's played a role in the consumption growing, like you were saying?
Yeah, and I think probably the biggest role that social media has played is in instant gratification. It's changed. I think we want everything now. And so even when you think about social media, you can click the image and buy the product all within 5 seconds. Whereas when we were consuming through print media or billboards, there was a journey that you had to go through where it was discovery, research, maybe going to a shop to try on. And it was a much longer, more considered life cycle or journey to buy the product. And along those stages, you might have time to consider, can I afford this? Does this make me feel good? Is this instant gratification? Whereas now with social media, we're consuming so quickly that we're maybe not going through the stages of consideration the way that we once did.
And I think also with social media, it stimulates comparison. People compare themselves to each other a lot more, lifestyle, the way they look, the way they dress. And I think there's a lot more envy, jealousy, comparison. And that's another layer to it as well that stimulates this need to consume. Would you agree?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think we're always putting our best face and foot forward on social media, and it's not necessarily capturing real life, but
It's all filtered. Yeah.
aspirational life, which ultimately, even if it's not an influencer or brand putting out messages, we as individuals are putting out messages as well that lead to consumerism.
Exactly. Do you have any advice for our listeners as how they could maybe slow down their own consumption? How can they catch themselves? How can they change their mindset? How can they stop shopping as much as they are? Not saying that you're all shopping, but those of you who are, here are some tips.
The first thing always is education. If you're interested to know more or you're interested in habit change, it's just armoring yourself with education. So start with documentaries about fashion waste and the industry, sort of unveiling the problems. Read and try to follow brands that are making an effort and learn about the importance of those efforts. I think that education is for sure the start so that you can incorporate values into your decision so that you're consuming based on your values that you've established through educating yourself. I think as a man or a woman, I do think editing your closet is a very important step whereby you remove either those items that don't fit anymore, that you haven't worn in years, that need mending or repairing, and just having items in your closet that you love. I think a lot of our closets can distract away from knowing that we have things that we love and that we'll wear for years. I think you end up needing and wanting more when you're distracted by the abundance of things you don't wear. So
Marie Kondo your closet.
Yeah, really, I do think that makes a very big difference. And then buying things when you do that are less trend driven, as far away from trends as you can go, and just buying staples, wardrobe staples that are high quality and make you feel good, and making more considered purchases. So I often use the rule of I rarely buy something the first time I try it on. I still mostly go to stores to buy. I'll walk away from the item, and if I'm still thinking about it the next day, then I'll go back and make the purchase. But that's usually my litmus test. Is it still on my mind? Do I really love it enough to that journey back to the store to purchase? And if I don't think about it again, then it probably would have sat in my closet.
That's really, really good advice. And the other thing that I've noticed online shopping is how often do I buy something that doesn't fit? And then I can't be bothered to send it back, or I've lost the receipt, or I just don't make the effort to actually go to the post office, pay the postage, which sometimes costs more than what the item did to return it. And then I end up with stuff that not only do I not wear, but it doesn't even fit me. So one of the things I've been saying to myself is shop in stores, stop shopping online, because it's rarely successful.
Yeah, that is one of the perils of online shopping. I think the industry is still trying to figure out how to contend with the fit issues that come up with online shopping. And I think you're the majority in terms of that happening too quite frequently.
I was reading in another article that you were featured in that you were talking about the circular retail model. What did you mean by that? And how does that help the fashion industry?
Most industries have been linear for a long time. Linear basically just means take, make, dispose.
Yeah, make, take, dispose. Gotcha.
Make, take, dispose.
Yeah.
That's been the model that manufacturing model essentially that we've followed for a long time. And anything circular retail, circular commerce is basically trying to create a loop whereby end of life is considered so that we, of course, we reuse as much as possible throughout the lifespan. And then ultimately, whatever is created in waste, we can create another input in another item so that as little as possible is detrimental to the environment along that life.
So are you talking about kind of recycling things in the end so that they can be turned into something else?
Yeah, so for us, we're somewhere along that loop in terms of reusing products for as long as they can be reused in their lifespan, but we haven't closed the loop. So that's a goal of ours, is to figure out how to repurpose waste. So as every parent knows, lots of kids will either tear their clothing or will stain it beyond cleaning. There is a fairly significant portion of kids' wardrobes that are not reusable, or it can't be donated, can't be reused by another child. And so what we're trying to ultimately close the loop on is how can everything be repurposed so that it doesn't go to landfill. And that would be a fully circular model.
What might some of the ideas that people could use their old clothes for to repurpose them just in the home if they were thinking about that? Like, I guess rags for cleaning is one.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you can think of? Masks. You could make a mask out of a bra because we've got the virus going on. I've seen people do that.
Yeah, some people are quite crafty, and there's ways that you can make rugs from old t-shirts. There are several ways, but I think to make recycling really mainstream in terms of ensuring none of that waste goes into landfill, it needs to come more at a company level. There needs to be someone facilitating that process for the masses. Not everyone is as crafty and has time to make those solutions at home. And there is a lot of advancement right now in the industry towards those solutions. So it's coming, and it's coming quite quickly. We don't have all the solutions yet, but I have no doubt that it's just going to be a number of a few years before we can.
Oh, that's interesting. I was wondering if people were even onto it yet. It's great to know that they are and that there may be solutions coming soon. I was wondering that, so that's good to know. Do you think there's a difference when shifting mindsets of Asian and Western consumers when it comes to sustainable fashion?
I think on this side of the world, pollution is so pervasive in our everyday. We see air pollution, we see sea pollution, we see land pollution. And so I think Asian consumers and also anyone living on this side of the world feels the urgency perhaps more than other parts of the world. And they're looking for solutions. But I have to say, all consumers, unless you can present a viable alternative, both in terms of price and quality to the alternative, consumers still aren't en masse willing to make shifts unless we present them with meaningful alternatives that can fulfill and satisfy the same as the non-environmental alternatives. So I think the desire to change patterns and consumer behaviors is probably as relevant, if not more relevant, in this part of the world. But we have to present those alternatives for people to make the shifts.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. What sort of feedback do you get from your customers who visit Recycle?
Mostly everyone loves it, and they really are enthusiastic about the lifestyle benefits and become rather obsessed with incorporating it into their lives. I wouldn't say daily lives, but certainly regular lives in terms of clearing out their closets and doing away with what they no longer need and bringing in what they do. So it's become a service that people are really incorporating into their family lives, which has been wonderful. And yeah, I think that's the most encouraging thing that I've seen. I spent a long time in the industry, as you know, and consumers are incredibly fickle out there. They tend to just go wherever the wind is blowing. And one of the most encouraging things is that the customers that we do have and the sellers that we do have are really, really loyal, and they both shop and sell with us very, very regularly. So we're really proud of what we've built in terms of the community, and that we've actually managed to shift consumer behavior. So a lot of our parents are telling us that they're buying better quality brands to start with. So even if they're buying firsthand fashion, new fashion, they're buying knowing that they can recycle it with us after their kids' use. They're taking better care of their clothes to make sure that they can keep it recirculated. So we're hearing basically that habit changes are being had as a result, which is really the
That's
goal.
absolutely brilliant. And look, congratulations on being a real change maker in Hong Kong for sustainable fashion. You really are. Like, I can't believe the media articles on you and how prolific you are out there, getting your voice out there and getting the message out there and educating people in Hong Kong. It's really brilliant. I can't thank you enough for coming on my show as well. It's been absolutely fascinating. I've learnt loads. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And just a final question, what are your hopes for the future of fashion in Hong Kong?
I hope what happens in Hong Kong happens in the rest of the
Globally,
world.
yeah.
I think for us in Hong Kong, I think it does, again, come down to education. We had the opportunity to work with documentary filmmaker in Hong Kong. And
Joanna Bowers.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
The film hasn't yet been released, but she did get permission, and I hope she won't mind me saying this, but she did get permission to film through a drone the textile landfill in Hong Kong. And I do think seeing results in action. So I think a lot of people can't see and can't feel the problem as individuals. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And I haven't myself seen the footage, but I do think it's going to be extremely alarming. And I hope that that visual indication will also serve to end her whole film, but I hope it will serve to further change behaviors and recognize what a problem we've created. And I hope there's a lot more solution makers and that people will be inspired to create solutions in the industry, both young people who have the power to change the industry and those that are consuming. So my hope in Hong Kong right now is that awareness and the shifts happen and that customers are really thinking about end of life. So everything that they purchase, whether fashion or otherwise, they're thinking about what am I going to do with this product when I'm finished with it and how can I responsibly recycle or reuse it.
I hope so too. And you've certainly got me thinking about it. Hopefully my listeners out there will be thinking about it as well, which is really nice. How can people get in touch with you if they'd like to learn more about Recycle or see other things that you're doing in the industry? How can they find you?
We're everywhere just at Recycle. So we're on Instagram and Facebook under Recycle. And then our website is just www.recycle.com. And of course, you can get in touch with me directly. My email is just sarah@recycle.com. And I'd love to hear from anyone.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'll put all those details in the show notes as well. So thank you once again, Sarah, for the amazing, insightful interview. And I think you're just doing an amazing job and it's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jules.
For my listeners out there, if this is something that is meaningful to you and you think that you've got friends or family who will really benefit from hearing about sustainable fashion and my interview with Sarah, please can you share this podcast with them? Could you go to iTunes, please, to rate and review Hong Kong Confidential? And that will help me go up the charts and also people become more aware about sustainable fashion. And I'm now going to ask Sarah 4 secret questions, which only my patrons on Patreon can access. So for as little as $1 a month, you can join me on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/Hong Kong Confidential, then you can sign up to support this podcast and then you can access the secret questions from Sarah and also my last 20 guests since I've started this wonderful initiative. That's all for the podcast. Thanks again, Sarah, and hopefully we'll see some of my listeners in Patreon for the 4 questions. See you later. Hi, Confidants. I want to tell you about my Patreon page. I've joined Patreon in the hope of getting sponsorship for my Hong Kong Confidential podcast. Patreon is a great way for my listeners to get on board and sponsor me with monthly payments, and that goes towards my production costs and rewards for my members. If you're interested in checking out my Patreon page, please go to patreon.com and search up Jules Hannaford or Hong Kong Confidential. I would really appreciate you visiting my page. So that brings us to the end of another Hong Kong Confidential podcast. I'm Jules Hannaford. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me again next week. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please can you go to iTunes to rate and review it. I would really appreciate your feedback. You can email me at jules@hongkongconfidential.net, and you can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Hong Kong Confidential. If you'd like to hit me up on Twitter, it's at Jules Hannaford. I would love to hear from you.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.